Anya. Thank you um, for inviting me today. I'm hoping that I was just saying that I've had some Wi-Fi connection issues this morning, and I'm hoping that the connection is okay and that the audio and everything's fine. But let me know if not, not that I know what I'll do about it, but anyway. And yeah, I'm very happy to be. I'm very sad not to be. Initially, this conversation to do this came about because I was kindly invited to speak at the conference that I think is happening very soon in the UK for this network. But unfortunately, yeah, I'm a month off going on maternity leave, so it was a bit too close to to the date for me to commit to anything in the next few weeks. So I'm sad not to be able to meet you in person at the conference, but hopefully on another occasion. I'm very pleased to be able to do this instead and share some of my work. And I want to say that what I'm talking about today is very much work in progress. In fact, it's kind of more of an idea for a project that I'm hoping to be able to pursue. So it's kind of a proposal for research that I think is needed, rather than actually research that's already been carried out, although it does build on work that I have done in the past, particularly as part of the Data Justice Lab. So what I want to focus on today is the relationship between the welfare state and digital technology providers in the context of data-driven innovation and perhaps most notably artificial intelligence or AI. And I want to do that because I think a lot of focus has been on the growth of large technology companies and on the way AI might transform industries and consumption. But I actually think in comparison, we've had very little on how it might transform the state. And so that's the kind of, those are the questions that I'm interested in here. And I'm just going to share some slides, if it's allowing me to. Doesn't seem to actually, let's try. I have to allow it to do it. Okay, that's annoying. One second. Seems like I need to allow it to do that. Right, let me try that again. See if it will allow me this time. Yeah, it seems like it will. Okay. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Yeah, great. So I think this question of state-tech relations is perhaps more pressing than ever, for quite obvious reasons, in that we're increasingly seeing the kind of open consolidation of politics and technology, very starkly with something like the inauguration of Donald Trump. But I think also within Europe, which is kind of the perspective that I'm situated within, where governments, and obviously particularly the UK, but Europe more generally, governments are firmly entering into the geopolitical race towards AI leadership that really acts as a very significant pretext for what is essentially so far has been its unfettered developments and an ever closer relationship between the state and technology providers. So I want to reflect a bit on that question with a particular emphasis on the welfare state and the functions of the state oriented towards the protection and well-being of citizens. So the reason I want to focus on the welfare state is that although it's sometimes been dismissed as irrelevant, I think there's been an enduring significance of the welfare state evidenced by, for example, the unprecedented economic intervention and renewed emphasis on social security and planning that was ushered in by the COVID-19 pandemic, where Europe's responses in particular were illustrative of a historical commitment to a so-called social dimension, often also regarded as a neglected aspect of the European project, but also showcasing the extent to which that commitment is now bound up with digital technologies. And in many ways, the pandemic, we can regard it as a sort of significant juncture in the relationship between the state and digital technology, as governments across the world entered into a host of partnerships with organizations at unprecedented speed to extend and create data infrastructures across key areas of public and social life. In fact, we could say that the pandemic made clear that not only about the continued relevance of the welfare state, but the datafied nature of the contemporary and future welfare state, in which data infrastructures and technology companies have come to play a crucial role, both in terms of fulfilling coercive as well as supportive functions. And I think also invoking the welfare state allows for kind of normative orientation towards the state based on ideas around specific values and forms of regulation that focus on the capacity for political regulation of the market economy. And also values that, for example, speak to commitments to decommodification, social solidarity, and universalism. And here I'm also engaging with this idea around a European social model associated with the welfare state, even though I know that the notion of a European social model has been deemed largely obsolete, both as an aspiration and reality in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. But I think following both the UK leaving the EU and the adoption of the European Commission's European Pillar of Social Rights, there are grounds for revisiting this kind of idea of a European social model, both in terms of its intended purpose, but also in terms of its actual functioning. And also, I've done a lot of analysis of EU policy around something like AI, and I think that there have been growing efforts within European regulatory frameworks to try and account for social commitments in the face of computational developments, which is seen as something like the EU's Platform Directive, for example, but also sections of the AI Act, which includes provisions that pertain particularly to social protection and employment. And also at national levels, we've seen commitments expressed in guidelines for AI and the uses of AI in the public sector. The idea of auditing is bound up with questions around social commitments and also revised remits of data protection agencies, which are increasingly working across also questions around employment and so forth. At the same time, there's also growing recognition amongst policy actors of the continued need to rethink the meaning of a European social model and the unique set of challenges that are involved in transitioning that model to what I've referred to as a kind of European social technical model that's fit for purpose. So essentially, how to deliver these social commitments as they are now increasingly being provided through computational infrastructures. And although it's been foregrounded and compounded by the pandemic, along with rapid advancements in platforms, digital platforms, and AI, the datafied welfare state follows a development that's been emerging in several European countries for quite some time. Philip Alston, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, he argued just prior to the onset of the pandemic that this idea of a digital welfare state is already a reality, and this was back in 2018, is already a reality and is emerging in many countries across the globe. And in these states, systems of social protection and assistance are increasingly driven by digital data and technologies that are used to automate, predict, identify, survey, detect, target, and punish. So, for example, uses of automated decision-making or decision support systems that rely on the algorithmic processing of data within public bodies that are now well established across Europe, most notably in areas of unemployment, benefits, social care, policing, education, and health. And in research I've done myself on uses of predictive analytics within the public sector in the UK, for example, we've argued about the advent or described the advent of what we call sort of citizen scoring that essentially entails the use of data analytics in government for the purposes of categorization, assessment, and prediction at both individual and population level. So it includes things like the allocation of treatment in public health systems, sorting unemployed people, identifying child neglect, or detecting benefit fraud that have all been reported across welfare states in Europe. So just quickly to sort of illustrate what we mean by this datafied welfare state through some of the work that we've done at the Data Justice Lab, for example. And this was back in 2018, I should say. And I think a lot of these developments are now far more established than they were at the time that we were looking at them. We mapped the uses of algorithmic systems, particularly predictive analytics within the public sector in the UK, and found that the use of kind of risk verification tools in areas like benefit fraud and child welfare was becoming more common, and now it's fairly widespread. It's often the idea is that you aggregate different data sets and then you use these to predict the likelihood that someone would commit benefit fraud or would be at risk of child exploitation. And we found that while some of these tools are developed in-house, overwhelmingly they were being provided by really only a handful of commercial data brokers, often introduced as pilots and then gradually integrated into practice, despite several concerns about them amongst frontline staff. Another area we've looked at in the Data Justice Lab has been in policing, where we know that there have been a growing investment into various data-driven tools. But a prominence practice is something like neighborhood mapping using various data sources to predict where and when crime might happen in order to then allocate police resources accordingly. And also in our research, we focused a lot on technologies that are used to predict individual criminal behavior as well, like ranking offenders, for example, from high to low risk based on patterns of behavior and characteristics from previous criminals, or the creation of registers or lists. Very controversially in the UK, something called the gang matrix was created by the Metropolitan Police, for example, which seeks to identify potential criminals and victims based on data from different social relations. But we also looked at the growing use of recognition technologies, both facial recognition and voice recognition, in determining who might be a criminal. And we did an in-depth study of, for example, the European initiated project, Speaker Identification Integrated Project, or SIP, which is a voice recognition database in Europe that is used to identify potential criminal and terrorist acts based on open source mobile and social media voice data. Similarly, in migration, we've looked at the creation and use of large databases, particularly based on biometric data like fingerprinting, and the investment in border technologies that experiment with a number of different techniques for the purposes of migration management. One tool we looked at in depth was a piloted project called iBorder Control, which tried to base assessments on travelers based on facial recognition, facial expressions, trying to sort of detect so-called bona fide versus non-bona fide travelers coming into Europe. It's been widely discredited and challenged, but also was illustrative of the growing role that these technologies are now playing within borders in the context of securitized European borders. And then finally, briefly, just to mention, we've also looked at the workplace and work. And there's been a lot of research there, of course, on the transformation brought about by platform capitalism, particularly with regards to new types of work, like gig work, crowd work, and delivery and tax services. We focused a lot on how algorithmic management techniques associated with those kinds of platforms have migrated to standard workplaces more and more, as well as longer standing sectors like call centers, but also postal work, public service work. And focus particularly on the uptake also of automating hiring systems, including the use of AI, which has proliferated since the pandemic. And these are tools that are used more and more for profiling, using a combination of various different data sources, including language and facial cues, for example. So this is all kind of early research that we've done within the Data Justice Lab that document the datafication of different parts of public life that I think are now pretty well established. And in fact, just in the last year or so, we've seen the proliferation of plans to intensify a lot of these processes of datafication across European state, with the advancement of AI in particular, that's set to significantly transform the economy and the public sector, from the integration of AI across healthcare to AI-driven personalization of government services to new large procurements of generative AI provision across national and local bodies. But while there's sort of efforts to try and map these kinds of developments and so forth, I think we lack a proper understanding of how this transformation is actually going to be delivered, but also, for what I want to talk about today, significantly put by whom, and also on what terms, and with what implications for the welfare state. So whether we think of state-tech relations in times of crisis, like the role of companies like Apple and Google in providing health-related computational infrastructure during the COVID-19 pandemic across European states, for example, or the contracting of data brokers like Experian and Sanctura to inform everyday welfare decisions, or plans to partner with AI providers like Palantir to streamline public services, I think we have to ask, what is the nature of these relationships? What's the actual role of these digital technology providers in welfare states today? And are we seeing the emergence of a new institutional form based on these state-tech relations? Because importantly, the turn to data-driven innovation in public bodies has overwhelmingly been advanced as an efficiency measure, with implications for administrative processes rather than a policy intervention with political ramifications. And this is despite concerns being raised both within and outside public bodies about impacts on citizen rights, professional practices, accountability, and democracy, that have sought to illustrate how the uses of these technologies may also cause harm. So, for example, in my own work, I've advanced a research agenda that accounts for the sort of social justice implications of the growing reliance of data-driven technologies under this framework of data justice that foregrounds how the users of these technologies impact different communities in disparate ways. But the issue is that in these discussions, there's been a tendency to focus on the data systems themselves, and attributing harm to technological features or aspects of algorithmic design. The notion of algorithmic bias is very prominent in that regard, without really engaging with the wider context or indeed the social relations that surround these technologies. And also, whilst we've had kind of growing concern about the escalation of the technology industry and the societal position it now occupies, we haven't really focused on how this development has intersected with the role and transformations of the state. And mainly that's been around sort of questions of security, like, for example, state surveillance has obviously been a lot of discussion in public debate, particularly in the aftermath of something like the Snowden leaks back in 2013. But I think this has distracted from the more mundane and everyday features and functions of the state. That's also limited our understanding of the way the growing power of technology companies has intermingled with rather than disregarded governments, as platforms and AI systems take on role and functions that are previously associated with the state. And I think, the welfare state serves as a useful lens for this because it allows us for this normative orientation towards the purpose and parameters of the state that engages with everyday functions and the delivery of public services. But also, debates on the welfare state has, of course, have for a long time invoked concerns with the growing reliance on private actors and an orientation towards serving market interest. So in this case, we need to understand the welfare state as simultaneously instrumental to contemporary citizenship, but also historically threatened and undermined by shifting ideological frameworks like neoliberalism, for example. And the welfare state in this context is not simply a program of social welfare and the provision of social services, but here I draw on Office definition that refers to it as a formula that consists of the explicit obligation of the state apparatus to provide assistance and support to those citizens who suffer from specific needs and risks as a characteristic of the market society. And it's based on a recognition of the formal role of labor unions in both collective bargaining and the formation of public policy, and therefore requires us to think of this datafied welfare state beyond the idea of digitalization of public administration, which has dominated a lot of the research in the area, and instead consider how the advent of platforms and AI relate to institutional formations and state functions, and also what political realities are possible. Because as often has argued, there was nothing inevitable about the emergence of the welfare state. The welfare state in Europe is a political solution to social contradictions that emerged out of a specific matrix of social power, an outcome of the ways in which social classes, collective actors, and other social categories were able to shape the environment of political decision-making. So this requires us to consider how state-tech relations in the datafied welfare state exist within or shape these matrices of social power. So what kind of matrix of social power are we offered today with these state-tech relations? And in particular, by engaging with 4 different features of state-tech relations in this datafied welfare state that I'm going to outline now, I want to make the case that we are witnessing the potential advent, so it's a hypothesis and its potential advent of what I call a tenant state, in which state-tech relations mimic those of tenant landlords based on new modes of governance, infrastructural dependencies, economic models, and regulatory capacities that challenge definitions of a European social model. And this notion of a tenant state builds on emerging debates on the future of public institutions as operations of the state are increasingly executed through computational infrastructures, and also engages with discussions about their potential displacement in the face of new forms of platform and computational power at the intersection of governance, infrastructure, and market. And obviously, I'm sort of playing along with the ongoing debate within platform capitalism about the significance of rent within that by talking about the tenant state. But I'm also sort of, using that term because a lot of these technology providers in their contracts, platforms in their contracts with clients, refer to clients as tenants. So it's also sort of to rethink the state as a client in these terms. And these kinds of debates push the parameters of how we should understand the intersection of the state and technology, pointing both to the complexity and multifaceted nature of computational transformations that suggest that existing frameworks for analyzing this relationship may be inadequate. And instead, we might have to understand state-tech relations as both extending and shifting previous forms of state capital hybrids or private-public partnerships that involve kind of key significant features that are potentially different to how we've understood sort of service provision in the past. So the first is governmentality, and that comes, a key focus in research on the research in research is on the growing reliance on data infrastructures in the welfare state in terms of how it shapes public administration and the delivery of public services. So my own and others' research, for example, have shown how the increasing use of data-driven technologies in the public sector has been significant for changes in things like expertise, the way decision-making is made, as well as engagement with citizens across public sector bureaucracies. Karen Young has summarized some of this debate as a paradigm shift in public administration from a regime of new public management that's associated with neoliberalism to a regime of new public analytics associated with the use of computational analysis that has its theoretical foundations in data science and in statistics. Helen Margetts and Dunleavy have also identified different waves of what they describe as sort of digital era governance, where starting in the mid-1990s with early digitalization and exploring the potential for integration through online services, and then the second wave of designing services as online first and the idea of digital by default, and early big data usages and cloud development, and now our current third wave, which is oriented towards cloud services and the development of data science and AI capabilities that really explore the potential for what they describe as new bureaucratic organizational forms. So there's been a suggestion here of a potential transition in actual governmentality, understood here as the techniques and strategies by which a society is rendered governable, distinct from previous modes of governance and statecraft. So building on James C. Scott's account of the high modernist state, Foucault and Gordon, for example, have argued that we've moved from this high modernist state to the neoliberal state to now what they refer to as the dataist state. And they argue that in an age of big data and machine learning, the state's use of technologies heralds a deeper transformation of statecraft itself, because as automation takes over significant parts of state operations and governance becomes oriented towards the identification and legibility that's afforded through this ubiquitous collection of data, and this dataist sort of state embodies a new form of governmentality premised on the notion that a society consists of data flows, and the responsibility of the state is to collect and process this data. And a well-governed society is one in which events are aligned with the state's models and predictions, no matter how disorderly in high modernist terms. I'm just going to admit this person who's, okay, because I can't, there we are. Then secondly, infrastructure. So importantly, the dataist state is a culmination of a commingling of private and public actors afforded by technology and the long-standing reorientation of the state to serve the market. Because they're privileging data flows and models and predictions garnered from data processing and analysis, this data state, therefore, is subject to competition from any institution that's able to make better predictions or deliver better outcomes in this kind of following this sort of dataist logic. So this tends to move governance into the hands of large corporations who are the ones who have the computational power and the labor to process and analyze large data sets. So the enhanced dependency and concentration that comes with this power of compute, so-called, has foregrounded this kind of infrastructural approach to understanding platforms and AI that highlight both the potential public value, but also the embedded nature of these technologies in society and the complex ecosystems that sustain them. So research on public sector platforms has sought to highlight how central aspects of delivering welfare in European welfare states is now bound up with the convoluted third-party infrastructures based on different forms of tracking, storing, and controlling data. And with the growth of something like foundation models associated with generative AI, Burkhardt and Reeder, for example, have outlined how the platformization that's afforded by the infrastructure of these models further strengthen big tech's dominance over the field of computing, and also through their broad applicability, many other economic sectors as well as governments. So a key question for the datafied welfare state is what an engagement with data-driven technologies at an infrastructural level might reveal about state-tech relations in this current matrix of social power, and how this matrix might signal potential discontinuities in capitalism and who holds power in capitalism. So someone like Mackenzie Wark, for example, has argued that this infrastructural power that technology companies now hold has shifted power away from the capitalist class who own the means of production, as we've traditionally understood power in capitalism, towards what they describe as a vectorialist class, and that refers to those who own the vectors along which information is gathered and used. So while a capitalist class owns the means of production, the means of organizing labor, a victorious class owns the means of organizing the means of production. So it's this kind of underlying power, infrastructural power that they're referring to here, that signals a potential shift in power relations. And then thirdly, alongside an emphasis on infrastructure, datafication has also been said to be a political economic regime linked to trends of assetization and financialization, in which data is both valuable and value creating, propelling new ways of doing business and governance. And the aim is to turn everything into a financial asset as a way to latch onto circuits of capital and consumption for the purposes of rent extraction, whether that be in the form of money or data. I think this argument around rentierism has become very popular. And also, I would say I'm not fully on board with it, like particularly sort of those who argue that it's actually techno-feudalism and so forth. I think that's, for example, doesn't pay enough attention to the role of the state. But payment to an economic actor is made purely by virtue of that actor controlling something valuable or that creates an impression of value made profitable due to particular circumstances of a dearth of market competition. So although this logic of rentier capitalism is not new for capital, what is new are the complex technologies that have been designed to extend and empower capital's abilities of assetization, extraction, and enclosure. And the main strategy of rentiers, so these technology providers in this case, is to turn social interactions and economic transactions into services that take place on their platform, extending this kind of idea of software as a service model into all other spheres. So we can start thinking of it as transport as a service with something like Uber, for example, or welfare as a service, indeed, where we have moved from these kind of idea of selling one-off shrink-wrap software to public sector towards this kind of agile production model in computing and engineering that privilege these software as a service products. So by understanding this development through the lens of rentierism as the dominant economic model of data-driven innovation, we can see how technology companies advancing this X as a service product become embedded within government and public sector bureaucracies. So Tamar Sharon, for example, has referred to this development as forms of sphere transgression that see digital know-how and expertise translated into advantages for technology companies in all spheres undergoing digitalization. So from healthcare to education to social security, regardless of their lack of domain expertise. So by plugging into this political economy of datafication and to this logic of rentier capitalism, the datafied welfare state therefore not only advances the commodification of information about its citizens and the outsourcing of services, but they're also locked into a form of social ordering and that restructures practices in order to uphold this political economy, turning more and more things into data and using products as services on platforms. So they get locked into this logic too. And this, I think, has implications, therefore, for their capacity for political regulation. So finally, a key concern is the extent to which state-tech relations in the datafied welfare state are conducive to the capacity for political regulation of the market economy, particularly negotiating between capital and labor, for example, as a key feature of a European social model. But also Ferrari has argued that the common understanding of the state as a regulator of platforms hasn't adequately accounted for the other key functions of the state, namely as facilitator or as buyer and producer, that all enable or constrain the agency of the state to regulate platforms. So although dilemmas between these different functions may not be new, Ferrari argues that they've become a defining feature of state platform relations in which the state is having to regulate while also facilitating platform capitalism and importantly, acting primarily as a buyer of platforms and AI and less as a producer. So this has significant consequences for the state's ability to act as a regulator and how that regulation is pursued. And also research I've done together with Jedrick Nicholas on the place of social and economic rights in recent policy debates on AI within Europe has shown that these tend to be subsumed within a market-oriented approach that favors a political orientation towards consumer and civic rights. In other words, there's been this kind of the dual objective that has guided digital strategy in Europe, which sees, the strengthening of a common competitive market for services and products on the one hand, and then introducing measures for market correction on the other, has provided a strategic framework for legitimizing market growth in relation to data and AI by privileging individual consumer and political rights over collective social and economic rights that are more closely related to welfare state functions. And also, the ability of platforms to both create and control markets has been shown to undermine and bypass any formal role of labor unions, continuing to challenge regulatory mechanisms in place to protect citizens against market risks. And I think this is particularly important in light of discussions that are also happening on the way industrial policy features data-driven innovation. And that's particularly prominent now with these new, most recent iterations of AI plans that have come up across Europe, where we see research on national growth strategies have shown that the overriding objective of digital growth that has dominated welfare state strategies in Europe paradoxically produce retrenchment of welfare state capabilities and critical assets. So Mazzucato and Collinson have also made the case that a key aspect of this retrenchment is not only the transfer of expertise to private actors, but the obfuscation of accountability that comes with the way these actors are now embedded at the center of government operations. So there is, in other words, a significant tension and possible contradiction between the advancement of platforms and AI as industrial policy and the capacity for the datafied welfare state to meet its obligation towards its citizens. So these features therefore indicate that state-tech relations in the datafied welfare state may be giving rise to a new institutional form, what I've referred to as the tenant state, that has significant implications for the functions of the welfare state and any commitments to the European social model, including public values and public infrastructure that are meant to protect citizens against market risks. And there may therefore be grounds for rethinking what tools and responses are needed to engage with this institutional form, and whether those that have been leveraged in response to neoliberalism, for example, such as an emphasis on public ownership or bringing services in-house, actually make sense for what we're faced with now in terms of state-tech relations. And particularly if we consider the types of features that I have just outlined of those relations, or whether we need new conceptual frameworks to make sense of platforms and AI is distinct from how we've thought about it previously, or how we've understood service provision within their welfare states previously. And we might need to consider how the current matrix of social power that underpins the tenant state can be challenged to allow for other social technical models to be imagined, and consider what other political realities might be possible. In other words, how might the power dynamics of state-tech relations, as I have outlined them in the datafied welfare state, be different? It seems like these kinds of reflections are probably more necessary than ever. Okay, that's it. I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lina, for the very interesting talk. And Roberto, are you there to stop the recording?